I'm going to show you how to use variables in Postman. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
This is part 6 in a 10-part video series in which we're discussing how to make REST API calls. In this video, we are going to talk specifically about how to use variables in Postman. In the previous video, we talked about how to use workflows, collections, and folders to organize your REST requests. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use variables in Postman. Before we get started talking about why you would use variables in Postman, let's actually take a look at a web page that I think you'll find quite useful. If you go to this URL, you will find a very, very useful description of these things called variables. Now, I'm going to talk about variables with the slides that I've created, but there's a tremendous amount of really useful information here. So let's go ahead and go through my slides, and then after you hear my description of variables, you might want to take a look at this documentation. All right, now that you know about the Postman documentation about variables, let's talk about why you would want to use variables in Postman in the first place. Well, consider, if you will, the request that I'm displaying here. This is one that we've actually seen in previous videos. It's a REST request that's doing a GET to look up one specific orchestrator workflow. In this particular example, you'll notice that I have hard-coded the FQDN of my orchestrator server. And additionally, I have hard-coded the workflow ID of a workflow that I want to look up. That'll work. I can hit send and this REST request will work, but this is not very flexible. I don't always want to look up that specific workflow ID. I want to have a REST request that's more flexible and can look up any workflow ID. And similarly, I may not always want to talk to this specific orchestrator server. So instead of hard coding values like this, we can use variables. As you can see here, using variables, the first thing you're probably going to notice is that your URLs get a lot shorter. This example here is no longer hard coding the FQDN of my orchestrator server. Instead, I have changed it to use a variable. You'll know that you're looking at variables when you see open curly brace, something, close curly, close curly. So the thing inside those curly braces is the variable. In this same example, you'll notice that I'm no longer hard coding the workflow ID. Instead, I'm using a variable to indicate which workflow I want to look up. So again, you can use variables in a variety of ways. You can use variables in the URLs in your REST requests, but that's not the only place that you'll use them. You can use variables in specifying your query parameters. You can use variables when authenticating. You can use variables in your headers, in the body of your REST request, in the pre-scripts, the pre-request scripts, and the test scripts that run after your request is done. So these variables are quite useful in a lot of different ways. One of the things we mentioned briefly in the previous video is a mechanism in Postman called environments. Environments allow you to group together related variables. For example, as you can see in this screenshot, I'm looking at my environments. I have an environment called demos, and it contains these variables. Now, if I want to, I can create additional environments to house other variables. For example, you might have one environment called production and another environment called test dev. That way you can use the same requests, whether you're trying to run the request in your production environment or your test dev environment, but by switching environments and thereby switching the variables in their values, you can have a single set of REST requests that behave differently depending upon which environment you select. Now, if you are creating multiple environments, you need to specify which environment you want to use with this drop-down list. If you take a look in your Postman client that we've been using in the earlier videos, right now it doesn't not say demos. In fact, it probably doesn't list any environment at all. But we're going to start using environments because in order to use these variables, we're going to need an environment. Strictly speaking, that's not entirely true. Environments allow you to organize your variables, but you can actually use variables in a variety of different ways. For example, you can define global variables. So in addition to your environments, such as demos, you can set up global variables. Additionally, you can set variables on a per collection basis. So notice here in this screenshot, we've gone to collections. We selected our boardapi.com collection, and on its variables tab, you can set up whatever variables you would like to set up. Now, one thing I will point out to you that you do need to know is that depending upon where you set up the variables, you have differing degrees of control over exactly how they behave. For example, if you set up variables on the collection level, you can set the variable name, you can set its value, but you cannot specify whether this is just an ordinary variable or a secret variable. With secret variables, let's go back to demos. With secret variables, I could take something like this password that's currently being shown in clear text. By switching it from default to secret, you can hide sensitive pieces of information like this password. Again, in this screenshot, I'm not taking advantage of secret, but if I want to have variables with secret values, you need to do that at the environment level as opposed to the folder level where you don't have that option. So far in this video, I've been talking about how you can use variables in a manual fashion. You can manually specify a variable in a URL. You can manually specify a URL in authorization. You can manually specify a variable in your request body. Again, we've been doing things manually. But what if you wanted to work with these variables in a more programmatic way? You can, and we're going to show you how. Consider, if you will, the following example. Imagine you want to create some REST requests that are going to run operations on a VMware vRise automation server. VRA, if you're not familiar with it, is a cloud management platform to manage the deployment and ongoing monitoring and management of machines in vSphere, AWS, GCP, Azure, and so forth. So don't worry about exactly what VRA is. What I want you to know about VRA is that if you want to do REST calls to a VRA server, you need to authenticate. And in the world of VRA, authentication involves a two-step process. You first have to get what's called an API token, although sometimes it's called a refresh token. So I have a request here that's going to get me an API token, but we're not done authenticating. You then need to run a request to get an access token. So you get your API token first, then you get your access token. Why does that work that way in VRA? That's beyond the scope of this discussion. Just understand that we've got to get an API token first, and then we get an access token. And crucially, understand this. Get access token takes as input the API token that we got first. You get an API token, then you pass that API token into get access token. Make sense? Here, let me draw a picture. The API token that we get from the first request has to be passed into the second request. So how are we going to do that? Well, there's this word up here in the title, variables. We're going to do that with variables, but we're going to do it in a programmatic way. So let's take a look at how this works. Remember, on the previous slide, we saw that there are two REST requests. And in the first REST request, we are striving to get an API token. So here is the URL that you would use to get your API token. In order to get your API token, you do a post because we're creating a new token, post this URL, and you must specify in the request body the credentials for the connection that we're making. Now, if you're looking at the screenshot here, you can see we're using a variable here, and here, and here, and here. These 4 instances, we're using the variables in that manual way that I talked about earlier in this video. I'm not talking about this variable or these 3 variables right now. Those are all manual. What I want to show you is how you can programmatically create variables. So we do a post, we go to this URL, we send in our credentials, and we get back in response something called a refresh token, also known as an API token. This is the thing that we need to pass to the next REST request. So how do you do that? Here's the trick. In the Tests tab, you can make use of a method called pm.environment.set. In line number 3 of this code, we're using that method to create a new variable called API token. We are not manually creating that variable. We are not manually setting its value. Instead, we're using this to programmatically create that variable, and we're setting its value. That's the second argument here. We're setting the value to the refresh token that we just saw. Again, line number 3 is creating a new variable called API token that contains this value. Now, you may have noticed there's also lines 1 and 2. Why don't we take a few moments to talk about those 2 lines? Ultimately, we want to put the API token value right here. But in order to get that API token, we've got to go into the body and get this specific piece of info. Now, anytime you want to go into the response body, you're going to say something like var data. So we're creating a new variable called data. Doesn't have to be called data, but that's a pretty common name. Var data equals, and then we're using this method called json.parse to take the response body. That's this stuff down here. This is the response body. Line number 1 is taking that response body in its entirety and putting it into this variable called data. And then in line number 3, when we say data, that's this variable that's got the parsed up JSON response body, data.refresh token is grabbing this one piece of info. Now there's also line number 2. Line number 2 begins console.info. That's just a line of code that we've added in to do some debugging, logging messages. So the crucial parts of this code here are lines 1 and 3. Line number 1 is setting up the variable called data so that we can get whatever information we want out of the response body. And then crucially, in line number 3, we're using pm.environment.set to create a new variable called API_token with the value from this first REST request. And then that way, when we get to the second REST request, the second REST request can simply say, I want to use that variable called API_token. So again, you can set up your variables, you can change your variables, you can do things with your variables programmatically. And as you've seen here, not only can you do a pm.environment.set, you can also do things like pm.environment.get if you want to see the value of a variable. All right, so we've learned how to manually use variables in Postman, and now we've learned how to use variables in Postman in a programmatic way, but there's one more thing I want to share with you. We've been using Postman as our REST client throughout all the previous videos. But you'll recall from, I believe it was video number 2, we mentioned that there are other REST clients, such as curl. And in addition to REST clients, there are also programming languages such as Ruby and Python and Perl that allow you to do REST requests. So each of those, Postman, curl, PowerShell, Python, all of those different ways of doing REST calls, each have their own way of doing variables. Now there's no connection with those variables between those different environments, but they all have some sort of way of doing variables. So imagine, if you will, you are using curl to automate various tasks by having curl send REST requests. Well, if you're using curl, you could just use it at the command line, but more likely you're going to put your curl command into a Linux shell script. For example, this Linux shell script is using the born again shell syntax. So in this born again shell script, I'm setting up a variable called VRA_server. I'm saying its value is equal to sa-vra-01.vclass.local. And I'm setting up another variable saying workflow_ID equals, and then whatever the workflow ID may be. So in these two lines, we're setting the value of two different variables. Then we can use the curl command to say we want to do an HTTP GET. We want to go to this URL, and notice this URL has certain things that we're no longer hard coding. We're not hard coding the FQDN or the IP address of the server here. Instead, we're using the variable that we set up previously. And same thing for this workflow ID. We're not hard coding the workflow ID. We are using the ID of the value of this variable called workflow ID. Now, in this simple example here, we set the value of each variable once and the value never changed. But you might imagine a more sophisticated shell script that potentially changes that workflow ID, or maybe even changes the server name so that this curl command behaves differently under different circumstances. So as you can see, this is how you could use variables, specifically shell variables, in conjunction with curl. If you want to do the same type of thing with other mechanisms such as languages such as Ruby and Python and so forth, they'll let you do the same sort of thing. They'll let you set the value of variables. They'll let you use the variables. But obviously, the syntax may be different between those different environments. The way you set variables and use variables here in a Linux shell script is going to look different in other programming languages. But in general, you can use variables, not just the variables inside of Postman, but you can use variables in lots of useful ways, both inside Postman and outside Postman in other tools such as curl and those programming languages. So you now have a good deal of information about variables. I would like to remind you, at the very beginning of this video, I gave you a URL at learning.postman.com. It's a URL, I believe it ended in docs/sending-requests/variables. Super useful article. If you haven't already taken a look at it, go look at it and learn even more about variables. Please join me in the next video where we're going to learn about headers.